my name is Kirsten Sigua, and I'm going to be talking about the minimal coverage of women's sports in the media. Starting off, we're going to be talking about the background, specifically the women's representation in media over the years. There's been an increase of women's participation in sports since Title IX, which was passed in 1972, but there has not been an increase in the media, which includes magazines and newspapers. And this increase specifically was starting at 1 in 27 girls that participated to 1 in 3 girls currently in the past 49 years since Title IX was enacted. And then looking at the coverage in 1999 versus 2009, we look at ESPN SportsCenter, and we can see numbers that have decreased in the length of news stories, which went from 4.5% to 3.3%, and then also how often women got featured, which went from 3.2% to 2.3%. And then also looking at SportsCenter again in 2015, along with Fox Sports Live, we see that men's sports took up about 70% of the coverage time. The magnitude of this issue. Women's numbers are significantly lower when it's compared to men's sports coverage, which I'm going to be getting into in just a little bit. But even when women are included in that media coverage, they are being sexualized, which often includes the reporters too. This means that they're being looked at how much skin they're showing and just their looks in general, but not really their athletic abilities. And this Twitter study that I found in 2017, the aim of this study was to look at the amount of coverage for women's sports by local television sports broadcasters on Twitter, specifically in the LA area. And they looked at 19,469 tweets. And the 201 local broadcasters they looked at during this 2-week period. And women's sports only accounted for around 5% of overall tweets. And the peak of this women's coverage in sports was actually, they found, was 1999 for the LA local news, and that was 8.7%. And the person who led the study, her name was Cheryl Cookie. She had a quote that said, "We had days where we were collecting data on local news broadcasts or on ESPN SportsCenter, and there would literally be no coverage of women's sports." So as we can see, there hasn't been much progress or any progression really at all in the past 30 years, and it's pretty much been the same amount of coverage since the 1980s. And because of this, lots of women, especially the reporters that I mentioned, they don't think that covering women's sports is pretty beneficial for their career. And this is just an image just of what about my topic and pretty much what I have been talking about. It's the comparison of men's versus women's coverage during the 2013 NCAA basketball. And in the first section, in the main coverage on SportsCenter, we see that the men's basketball had 40 stories, while the women's only had 4 stories. And then in the second highlighted section, which is the ticker coverage, which is the text that runs along the bottom of sports and news stories in general, the men's had 56 stories and the women's only had 7 stories. Now, why does this matter? This pretty much matters because of the issues that I have mentioned, that the numbers are really significantly lower, but it also shows just a reflection of who this individual is when they are saying that women's sports, they don't want to see them on TV, they don't really hear about them, that type of thing. And it just really shows how society respects women's sports and how much they just have respect for women just in general. And as I have mentioned, no real progression has happened in many, many years, since the 80s pretty much, even though there has been that really high increase of women and girls' participation in sports. And this also matters because when there is that small boost of women's coverage, it really only happens when there's big events. And speaking of those big events, this includes the 2015 FIFA Women's World Cup, which also includes my slide of what to do next / the progression. So during this 2015 FIFA World Cup, there was a huge surge of women's coverage. 124 articles were published that contained in-depth work. And there was a positive shift towards women's representation, but again, it was only during this one small period. This is just one example of just those small, minuscule periods where these shifts did happen. And a more recent thing that actually did happen this year and this month was the Women's Sports Network being launched. And this is the first ever location of media to focus on female-only athletes. And these are soon to be streamed on Freevee, Tubi, Fubo TV, and Smart TVs, and they have lots of partnerships with many women-affiliated groups. But this is just only that one positive shift towards women's coverage, but we still have lots to do, of course. Thank you for listening.